Welcome back to the Back in Time podcast. I am your host, Kyle Autry, joined as always by my co-host, JD. JD, how are you today?
I have a bit of an important question to ask you, and I'm just going to jump right out of the gate and go with it. What's your favorite kind of pickle? And don't say potato.
I do not have a favorite pickle. They gross me.
Really?
Yeah.
Not at all. Like, even if you're grilling burgers at home, you don't have a go-to in the kosher aisle where you pick out a pickle?
Nope.
Do you like pickles?
I hate pickles.
Oh, well, there we go. Why didn't you lead with that, you freaking dum-dum?
All right. Well, we're off to the races here. Very random as always. Now, you guys are listening to a special episode. We're talking all things 80s with author Chris Clews. Before we dive into the episode and bring Chris onto the podcast, we want to just take a second to thank you guys for hitting the download button on today's podcast. Remember to rate, review, subscribe to the show, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, CastBox, and YouTube. That's the best way to help support the show and help us continue to grow. So on the line here, we are joined by author, speaker, and corporate culture expert Chris Clews. Chris is the author of the book, What 80s Pop Culture Teaches Us About Today's Workplace. Chris, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. I've been looking forward to this one for a while.
Yeah, excited to bring you on. I went through the book. It was, as you described, very quick read, which I like because I don't read a lot, which I think we've talked about on the show. So a nice 100-page book, this is perfect for a guy like me.
Yeah, that was the idea. It was, I really wanted to do something that was fun, quick, easy read. It wasn't meant to be the next On Walden Pond. This is very easy read.
And we're going to be talking about the book, but if you guys want to support Chris and take a read through the book yourself, you can buy that on Amazon. There's a link on his website right to that book, chrisclews.com. That's Chris, ChrisClews.com. And you can support Chris by doing that. Chris, before we dive more into the book, I guess I want to just start by, give a little background to our audience of, who you are, just dive into a little bit of, how before you got into writing the book and, kind of what you do today.
Sure. Yeah. So, I'm a child of the 80s. I think I'm the quintessential 80s child. I was born in 1970. So I really had my entire formative years during the 80s, from 10 to 1980, 1989 were my formative years. And I have had some nostalgia for the 80s for years. My friends actually are relieved now that I have an outlet to talk about the 80s and to talk about the movies and the quotes and the music, and probably not so much the fashion. I'm really hoping that doesn't come back. I'm glad to see that other things are. But yeah, I've had a huge nostalgia for the 80s. And I think when you get into your 40s, like I am now too, you really get even more nostalgic for the time that you grew up, and you start to understand and appreciate why, your parents were nostalgic for the time that they grew up. And that's kind of where I am now. And so I was really thinking about how I could take this passion and love for the 80s that I have that never went away and parlay it to something fun and something cool.
I was going to jump in there. I mean, what is it about the 80s do you think people kind of latch onto? Because I'm me and JD are both, probably 10 years younger. We're both 85 babies, but I gravitate more toward the 80s than I do the 90s. What do you think it is about that period of time?
It's interesting. I think people look back, and what I really think is interesting about the 80s and the way that I kind of that I explain it is, I think it was the first decade. It was the decade of the individual for the first time. I mean, we obviously had the 60s, and there was, free love, and there was the kind of the music was shifting from the 50s into the 60s. You had more genres of music. And then in the 70s, there was disco, and there was, I guess, this counterculture thing that was happening as well. But it was really the 80s where the individual exploded. And I think it was the first time that somebody could actually have a purple mohawk and walk down the street, and people maybe looked and said, oh, that's interesting. But it was the first time that somebody could actually do that and just kind of walk down the street and feel okay about it. And I think there's a real kind of hearkening back to this. I don't want to call it a simpler time, but certainly from a movie perspective and from an entertainment perspective, everything wasn't as packaged. So it feels real. When you listen to music from the 80s, when you watch movies from the 80s or television, it feels real. The characters feel real. The passion involved in the entertainment feels real. I'm sure there was some packaging of it commercially, but it didn't feel like it, if that makes sense. I think the individuality and the creativity just exploded in the 80s. There was opportunity for people to be creative that I just don't feel like those outlets were there before. And we started to see a lot more creativity.
Okay. JD, jump in on that. What do you think?
I think, first of all, you caught me while I was chewing on a pickle. You didn't ask me my favorite pickle. It's a sweet gherkin, and it's delicious. No, I agree completely with what Chris is saying here. In the 80s were a pivotal time for both the film market and the availability of writing and producing and directing, where we can get into more of on the one end, we have our schlock movies, which were massively huge, and everything that Troma did throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, all the way to the instant classics, which will never die, which we'll get into in our follow-up when we discuss John Hughes and everything that you've covered in your book. I think, when comparatively to like the 70s, which were, I think, more time dated, and the 90s, which were very progressive, the 80s were sort of on their own and live in this little world where they create universes that stand the test of time.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, look, the 80s, if you talk just really about, I know we're not going to get too much into music today, but the music is a good example of why I think people gravitate towards the 80s. When I write my books, and I'm on the second one right now, when I dive into each one of these movies, if you noticed in the chapter, I set the scene for people who were around in the 80s and people who didn't live in the 80s. I want you to understand the scene that was happening during the time that this particular movie came out. And part of that scene was the music. And what was really cool is that if you look at the top 40 or the top 100 during any time during the 80s, what you notice when you get to the top 10 and the top 20 is it was super eclectic. I mean, every genre was represented. And now, and even in the past 25 years or so, when you look at the top 10 or top 20, it's pretty much, I know it sounds old to say, it's the same stuff, but it's really, it really is a similar genre from number 1 to number 20. And if you go into the 80s, you had everything, you may have Debbie Gibson, Van Halen, and Neil Diamond all in the same top 10. And throw in Tone Loc. And you've got a top 10 right there. And that just doesn't happen anymore.
Tone Loc, also known for his role in Blank Check.
Yeah,
Gosh, I love that guy's voice. Tone Loc.
And Ace Ventura as well.
Yeah, he's in so many good things. But yeah, that's one of the things I really liked about reading the book is you would kind of start like each one with a little like 2 or 3 sentences about what was going on, what the music was. And I like that part just because I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize all that stuff was happening because I was a tiny infant. So it's cool to get that perspective from somebody that actually like lived through it. Like you're in your teenage years at that point, which had to be really cool.
Well, I was still an infant too. I was a 15-year-old infant. I'm a 48-year-old infant now.
So. Right. So what made you get into writing the book? Like when did this idea start, and what kind of brought it into fruition for you?
I think, like a lot of people, I was feeling a little stagnant or stale in my career. I've been in marketing for roughly 23 years, and I was in a job that just wasn't heading in the direction that I had hoped it would. And I guess you could call it having a self-pity party of one. I was home on a Saturday afternoon, laying on my couch, and lo and behold, The Breakfast Club comes on. And so I think to myself, well, this will definitely make me feel better because I love this movie, and I don't even need to have the sound up. I can pretty much mouth everything from the entire movie. And there's a point in the movie, classic scene in the movie, the whole movie's classic. By the way, if I ever was in a position to have influence and I had a lot of money, the first thing that I would do is I would get The Breakfast Club on Broadway. I just think that it is made for the theater. But that's a whole other conversation that we could have.
I would agree with that.
I think, can I interrupt really quick? Because that is a question that I've asked people before, and I want to hear Kyle's response. What is something that you would put on Broadway?
Jeez, I mean, The Breakfast Club sounds perfect for that. I know they've talked for years about putting The Goonies on Broadway. I've heard that in interviews with Richard Donner talking about that, but I don't know. Breakfast Club sounds pretty awesome. That would be something I would actually go to. Anything else, my wife's like, hey, we should go see this. I'm like, nope, not interested.
How about RoboCop the musical? How great would that be?
He's making a comeback with his KFC commercials.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
You could do a RoboCop and Toxic Avenger dual play.
Now we're on to something, guys.
So yeah, The Breakfast Club, I mean, honestly, I just think it would be phenomenal for Broadway, but I digress, which I do a lot in my books, by the way. I do digress a lot. So if you pick it up, it is a fun short read, but I do have some digressions because of the way that I write. My mind just goes in different places and I start thinking of something that's attached to something else, and you'll find some weird little nuggets in my chapters, but it's all by design. I was watching The Breakfast Club, and there's a moment where, Bender just doesn't want Principal Vernon to peer in on them anymore, and so he takes the screw out of the door.
Yeah.
And the door slams shut. And of course, Vernon comes in and he wants to know who did this and what happened to the door. And Bender's classic line is, screws fall out all the time. The world's an imperfect place. And I kind of sat up. It just hit me that my screws had fallen out and I was in an imperfect place. Just for whatever reason, thought, what a great lesson for the workplace, because I was feeling that in my job, this idea that the screws had fallen out and what am I going to do about it? I mean, here I am, the door is slammed shut and I'm trying to open it, it keeps slamming shut on me. And it just for some reason, it stuck with me. And so the next day I started writing an article on LinkedIn about what the Breakfast Club taught us about the workplace. And I started with that lesson and that idea of that screws fall out all the time. The business world's an imperfect place. The business world is an imperfect place. And I went from there. I got this incredible reaction to it when I posted it. I couldn't believe it. People from Australia, from all over the world, were saying, hey, this really resonated with me. This is cool. This is fun. And so I did another one on Ferris Bueller and work-life balance, and got another great response and thought maybe I have something here. And so I decided that I would write 10 of these chapters and put them in a book. That's how I did it.
That's cool. I love that story. And can we go through the 10 chapters and just talk about the examples that you use? We don't have to go like one by one. I just want to kind of like name the movies and maybe pick a couple of them. But yeah, Ferris Bueller was one of them. The Breakfast Club, Goonies, Say Anything, Christmas Vacation, Beverly Hills Cop, Back to the Future, E.T., Stand By Me, and Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. I mean, it's like every movie that I love. You put it in there as an example. We're kind of named after Back to the Future. I guess we should start there. Gosh, it's probably my favorite movie of all time. I don't know where you rank it. Was this a movie that you got to actually watch like in theater when you were a kid? I did. Yes. What was that like? Like when the movie ended and people started walking out, like what was the general response to that?
It's funny. Again, I go back to the 80s, but what I recall going into the theater is a much different experience. First of all, you had ushers. So if anybody was talking, not that we had cell phones, everybody was talking, you had a guy with a flashlight who came down and said, be quiet or get out. And that was a pretty cool experience, right? Because I paid $2 for this movie.
$2.
I was like, I paid $2. I had to go scrounging through my mom's washing machine to find those $2. So, and it really was. I mean, even like the paperboy from Better Off Dead who needed his $2 cash. I mean, that was probably for a movie ticket. So it was $2, and it was hard-earned money. And everybody was coming out of movies like Back to the Future. Everyone was smiling. That's what I remember. The movie theater was packed because anytime Spielberg put a movie out in the 80s, people went.
Yes.
Knew it was going to be good. Even if you ranked his movies and said, his worst movie of the 80s was X, it was still a good movie, and it was still entertaining, and people still walked away feeling good. And I think it was this idea that it took you away from everything. And that's hard to do nowadays because there's so many venues for entertainment. There's so many ways that we can escape nowadays with the internet. And we didn't have that in the 80s. So going to the theater was an escape. It was truly a different world. It was a different universe. And you just couldn't get it anywhere else. We had 3 channels, regular TV, and then you had, if you were lucky, you had basic cable with another, 16 channels. And it wasn't exactly great content, great original content. So,
by the way, I think the worst Spielberg 80s movie is probably Always. I don't know
Yeah,
if you remember that one at all. That's probably his only miss. I think he went like 8 for 8, knocked them all out of the park, and then had one little fart.
yeah, I think always, and it was totally different from what anything else he was doing. Even on television, by the way, he did a show. It was part of a show called Amazing Stories. That's actually being rebooted by J.J. Abrams, I hear.
Okay. I hope they put that on like Netflix or something.
It's going to be on Netflix.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but I heard it was going to be rebooted. And let me tell you, that show just ran for a couple of seasons, but it was super cool. And it could probably be really, really, really awesome now.
Okay. Well, let's go back to the Future a little bit. So you come out of the theater, like what's your first impression after watching the movie? What did you think about it?
I was blown away. I was just absolutely blown away by everything. How he kind of viewed the future. I mean, we didn't know. We had no idea. No idea what 2015 was going to look like, let alone 2000 or 1998. We had no clue what the future was going to look like. And his vision of the future was amazing. Like the hoverboard, we kind of take that for granted now. And people would look back on it and kind of, chuckle a little bit. But that was to us. I mean, I was skateboarding at the time and we had all 4 wheels on the ground. You were Tony Hawk and you were, 10 feet in the air. The rest of us were pretty much on the ground. And,
what were you rocking a Nash?
I had a number of different boards, but I had a Santa Cruz Slasher. I had the Skull and Bones Pal Peralta. I had a Mike McGill. I have a couple on my wall, actually. My old Hosoi is on my wall. I have a couple skateboard decks on my wall. You know that I'm a bachelor because when you come to my house, you see the artwork is either 80s artwork from the movies or it's skateboard decks from the 80s. Yeah, so I think coming out of that movie was really everything about it just was amazing. I was 15 or 16, and I wanted to go back in and see it again. I really just wanted to turn around and go right back in and watch it again because I felt like there had to be things that I missed. It was 2 hours of just completely being away from everything about my life, about high school, anything that was going on. I escaped. And I loved Doc. I mean, Doc Brown, that character is still to this day one of my favorites of all time.
I'm a huge Doc Brown guy, and even Biff, like he's the perfect bad guy for that era. Mm-hmm. Just like this tall, like looks like he might have been like one of the captains of the football team or the wrestling team, just picking on kids that are half his size. Like, what are you looking at, butthead? It's awesome.
And I'll tell you, like, I always look in these movies, I always go back and look to try to see if there was somebody who was playing a small character that became big.
Yeah.
Maybe they were there in the credits, they're like man number 3 by the truck or somebody like that. But in that movie, actually, I don't know, I put it in the book, but Huey Lewis actually had a small bit piece in it as an uncredited high school band audition judge. And, which I thought was great. I mean, I love Huey Lewis too, so I love those kind of things as well. When you look for the little, I don't know if you would call them Easter eggs, but these things that when you go back and you watch the movie again, you say, oh man, I know that person. They were in XYZ movie now. They're huge. And meanwhile, they were just this small kind of little role.
I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Billy Zane as one of Biff's goons in that movie, who basically has no speaking lines. That's right. And I would actually say, when you talk about the kind of the side characters that ended up being huge stars. Yeah. I would go to 16 Candles and John Cusack. Oh wow, yeah.
I mean, black and white would just capture the moment. I mean, that's a classic example of somebody who had a small role in an 80s movie and became John Cusack. And you know what? When I talk about the book, in the book I talk about the what we learned from these movies for our workplace. And what's really interesting about the Back to the Future is that it taught us a couple of things, and not to get too deep into the lessons themselves, but the two things that it really taught us. One was about answering every challenge, and that really came from the idea that when Marty was looking to get back to the future, and Doc Brown said, "Don't worry, as long as you hit that wire with the connecting hook at precisely 88 miles per hour, the instant the lightning strikes the tower, everything will be fine." When we think about that in our work, in our career, in our job, I mean, how many times have you felt like you had this challenge that was just insurmountable? I mean, I would call that an insurmountable challenge, how you're going to hit a connecting hook at 88 miles per hour right when the lightning strikes. And that's the only way he was going to get home. And so I looked at that and I thought that's an interesting quote to talk about insurmountable challenges, or what we think are insurmountable challenges at work, and how we overcome them. And how sometimes we don't have to be exactly precise. Sometimes we don't have to hit the hook exactly at 88 miles per hour. Sometimes 85 is good enough, or 82 is good enough to have a really good result. It wouldn't have been the case for Marty, of course, but for us in the workplace, for sure. So that was one lesson that we learned. And another one we learned from Back to the Future was about being a visionary, with the whole idea of roads where we're going, we don't need roads. That was the idea of being a visionary in your workplace. And when you're a visionary, people will follow you. They didn't really know. I mean, Marty didn't know if they really needed roads or not in the future. But he was willing to go along with Doc Brown because he trusted him as a visionary. He trusted his judgment, and he believed in him. After what he did for him, he, of course, believed in him. And so there's a really good lesson in there about being a visionary and how that can create the perception of being a leader in your company, when with your team, even if your title doesn't say leader, your title doesn't say manager, you can position yourself as one by being a visionary.
So now, to me, like hearing you talk about that, and I think, again, your book is fantastic, and everything that you're saying is so great as somebody that has a loathsome daytime job as well. I'm instantly wanting to hear you speak more about Axel Foley.
Okay.
He's, to me, like when I'm at work and I'm like trying to picture myself about what I'm doing and how I'm navigating, professional workspace and how I present myself on LinkedIn or what I'm posting on social media, I'm always kind of like, I'm kind of like this cool guy that's also really sneaky.
Yes. So, Axel Foley is, and you'll hear me say this a lot, but he really is one of my favorite characters in the 80s. And there's a number of reasons for that. But I will tell you also that there were two incredible roles in that movie. Actually, there's two incredible roles, and one that you have to go back and look again to see somebody who was doing one of their first roles. But Bronson Pinchot stole a scene, and it's very hard to steal a scene from Eddie Murphy, but he stole one from Eddie Murphy when he was in the art gallery. Surge. He stole that scene from Eddie Murphy with the whole Axel, Ackwell, Ahmed, that whole conversation. You got to go watch that 2 minutes on Google. When I need to laugh and I'm in a bad mood or things aren't going my way, I just pull up that scene on Google and it instantly makes me laugh, because if you watch Eddie Murphy, he's trying not to laugh himself. And apparently Bronson Pinchot did quite a bit of improv during that scene. So if you know that he did some improv with that scene going in, and then you go watch it, you'll watch Eddie Murphy and you can see they probably had a number of takes with that scene. And then Gilbert R. Hill, who played his lieutenant, his boss, or chief of police, whatever you want to call him, in Detroit, he was actually a real cop. And so it kind of showed, right? I mean, it kind of like R. Lee Emery when he played the drill sergeant. I mean, when you have experience doing something, it comes through. Axel Foley, just a brilliant character. And I think the thing that we really learned from him is about how to win with a lack of resources. I think that's the big workplace lesson that we get from. There's a couple of other ones as well, but the one that was my favorite to write for sure was when I talk about how he came to Beverly Hills with the idea and the intention that he was going to solve his friend's murder. And immediately he was stripped of the tools that he would need to be successful. His badge and his gun were taken from him immediately. In fact, he was thrown through a plate glass window and then arrested for disturbing the peace, for breaking said plate glass window, which was interesting. And he had nothing. He had the shirt on his back, which the Mumford High School phys ed shirt I have and I wear often to the gym. So I am actually a huge Axel Foley fan. And he had no gun, no badge. He didn't have anything at all as far as resources. The Beverly Hills Police Department had everything at their fingertips. Remember, this is 1984. They had computers. I mean, I had a VIC-20, I think, in 1984. I had the VIC-20 or Commodore 64. They were just kind of it was one of those things where, like, when you loaded a game on the VIC-20 or Commodore 64 and it had graphics, you had to wait 30 minutes for the graphics to come in. But when they did, you were, jumping up and down. Your buddies were like all hugging each other, saying this is the most amazing thing ever. And Axel told us about how to win with a lack of resources. The Beverly Hills Police Department had GPS technology, computers. They had more cops than the city of Detroit had people. They had guns and ammo. They had mahogany offices. And as Axel said, they had really clean and nice police cars that were nicer than his apartment. And all of these things at their fingertips, and they couldn't solve the crime, but he did. And he did that because he used his best tools, which were his internal toolkit, his instincts, his guts, his intelligence, his ingenuity, his intuition, and his pure grit. And I mean, you guys played football, right? I mean, you know what it takes to play football. There's the physical attributes that you have, but the guys who excel really have that internal toolkit. They have pieces of that, whether it's the intelligence, the intuition, the pure grit, the instinct, the guts, whatever it is. You have to have those things to be successful in football. And you have to have those things to be successful in the corporate and business world, because a lot of times you're not going to have the resources that the other guy has. Your competitors your bigger competitors probably started out with a lack of resources in the same position you were. And they were in a rowboat looking at a super yacht thinking, how do we get there? But they did it, and you can too. And so I think that's a really valuable lesson that he teaches us.
And, that's a great point. And to add on to what you're saying, one of the greatest lessons that I learned through playing sports throughout college is, I dwarfed by Kyle. Kyle's like 6'9", and his beard is like 7 foot tall. Okay. But one of the best lessons that I've ever learned is to play bigger than you are.
Yes.
And I think that's what Axel Foley does. He plays bigger than he is in a market that dwarfs it.
Yeah. So I guess we should ask Kyle if he'd like a peanut, right? You're 6'9".
I'm 6'3". I don't know where this 6'9" talk is coming from.
So hopefully you get the whole Princess Bride thing there.
Little Andre the Giant. I love it.
Oh man. Yeah. I had a chance to meet him, but that's a whole other story. It was amazing.
Oh God. Well, okay. Real quick. Cause I also met a giant, quite literally, if you remember Mark Eden, the Utah Jazz Center from the 80s and 90s, it was 7'5". Big. I have big hands. I wear XXX gloves. My hand felt like a baby in his hand. Like he literally wrapped around me. I was like, good God. Okay. And I'm pretty sure Andre the Giant had bigger hands than that guy. What was it like? Did you get to shake his hand?
Yeah, I think I was 9 years old at the time. And I'm still trying to find the picture. I found the autograph. Yeah. And my friend was a huge wrestling memorabilia guy, so I ended up selling it to him once I got it authenticated for him. Mm-hmm. But it was literally an autograph on because he didn't sign a lot of stuff, by the way. So I was lucky that he did that. I recall him putting his hand on my head, and it was substantially larger than my head. I remember him with a 2-liter Pepsi bottle in his hand, and it looked like a small V8 can. It was really like, once you've seen somebody that large, there's really no place else to go at that point.
Yeah, drinking a 2-liter of pop like it's a 12-ounce soda. I can't figure out why the man passed away so young.
He was not of this earth.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's so cool that you got to meet him and actually got something signed.
And I remember him being very nice. That's one thing I remember. I mean, besides obviously how enormous he was, that he was really a genuinely nice guy.
Did you get a chance to watch the 30 for 30 they did on him?
I did, yeah. There actually was an Andre the Giant documentary that I watched.
Yeah, that's right. It's not a 30 for 30. Was it HBO? It might have been HBO instead. I think Bill Simmons did it.
Yep, it was. Yeah, it was great. I mean, it was sad, but it was really, really phenomenal. And of course, they talk about the Princess Bride in there too, and how perfect he was for that, but how broken he was at that time as well, physically. Yeah. So that's one of the one of the 80s icons that I got to meet, which was pretty cool.
We have to talk about this because it's by far probably my favorite holiday film ever. It's Christmas Vacation. And just Clark Griswold, he's like the perfect dad. Like, talking about like, trying to be bigger than what you are. Like, he just wanted to be the best dad. Like, he wanted to build the pool. He didn't have the money yet. He was pretty sure he was going to get it, but he had plans. He's going to fly the whole family out. He puts them up in the house. Like, he's got to deal with Cousin Eddie, who's just a buffoon. Talk about Christmas Vacation a little bit and just how that one kind of goes into today's workforce and what we can learn from Clark W. Griswold.
Clark, yeah. So again, another one of my favorite characters of all time, and more than likely, Vacation will be in the second book.
Good,
I haven't quite decided yet, but there's going to be more than 2 books. So if it's not in the second one, it'll certainly be in the third one. But yeah, Christmas Vacation. And it's funny, the way I came up with that one was because when I first started writing the first book, it was actually early November when I wrote the Breakfast Club one. And by the time, December 10th or 12th had rolled around, I thought this would be a perfect time to write one on Christmas Vacation. So I wrote the article for LinkedIn, and then it ended up in my book. There's so many things I love about that character. I think he's, like you said, he wants to be the perfect dad, but he's, I don't know what the word is that I'm trying to think of, but he is so, he wants to be so perfect that he ends up being incredibly imperfect. I think that's why people love him so much. I think that's why they're attracted to the character. And again, by the way, this is a bigger conversation when we talk about the 80s. And earlier when you guys mentioned this fascination and this affinity for the 80s, and why is it that somebody who's 25 would dig the 80s movies and 80s music. And part of it was that the characters were so real. I'll give you just a quick example, and then we'll get back to Clark Griswold. So I think when you watch a movie like The Breakfast Club, for example, those characters, the athlete, the criminal, the basket case, the princess, and the brain, they represent a kid in every single high school across this country. And it will never change. Those 5 characters will be in every high school long after we're gone.
Or 50% of the sociopaths on this call, Kyle, looking at you.
Yeah, I probably fit all 5 of them at some point. And the thing is, like, but the great thing is that if you look at those characters and they looked like kids in high school, and you watch the movies today and the kids are driving $100,000 cars and they look like they're 28, and they don't look like the kids that most kids see in high school every day. And so they watch The Breakfast Club, or they watch 16 Candles, they even watch Ferris Bueller, and they can relate, I think, to these kids in the movies because they look like them. They act like them. Their personalities, the things that they deal with, are real issues that they're dealing with too. It's not fake stuff that some kid at a Beverly Hills high school is dealing with.
Well, let me interject really quickly, and I'm going to play the sad sap that I tend to do on our podcast. For me, like, Clark Griswold was the dad that I never had. And I think, the glut of the divorce rate going through the roof throughout the 80s and the 90s provided a platform for a lot of viewers to watch this perfect, idyllic American family and realize I can escape through National Lampoons and it can be funny and not everything has to suck. I'm half joking, but I'm half serious.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah. I think you're right. I think that he represented for, the 80s there was not only an explosion of creativity and ingenuity, and independence, but there was an explosion of divorce as well for many kids in their 80s, including myself. Yeah, I see where you're coming from in terms of a lot of kids looking at that and saying, that's I wish my dad was like that, or I wish my dad was here to do those things with me, or to try to do those things, to try to light up our house without, sending a tree through a window, or a stake through a window, and getting Elaine from Seinfeld, future Seinfeld, all fired. And then, by the way, of course, you have Rusty, who in Christmas Vacation, who is now Leonard Hofstadter on Big Bang Theory.
Love that show.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's what Clark represented, and I do think that he ended up in situations where, I think as we get older, we tend to end up in some of these situations as well. Maybe not to the extent that he does, but some of these scenes will resonate with you as you move towards life, or move through life, I should say. And you end up being the one who's trying to put the lights up. You end up being the one who's, in the mall with the girl, and you don't know what to say, which is one of my favorite scenes of all time. He cannot figure out what to say to the girl in the lingerie department. That is just a classic scene, and it's classic Chevy Chase. It's just a perfect Chevy Chase, and it's the perfect Clark Griswold. I do think that a lot of us, as you get older, you start to see some of yourself in Clark Griswold. I don't have kids, but for my buddies who do, that's all their life is about, is making sure that their kids get the experiences that maybe they didn't have, or have the experiences that they did have. And in order to do that, you got to have a little bit of Clark Griswold in you, because you're right. He really wanted the best for his family. But he did teach us some really interesting things. I'll tell you, between he and Cousin Eddie, talk about a classic character and somebody who seems to be very different off screen. Cousin Eddie and Clark taught us a really interesting lesson about knowing your audience. So if you guys, obviously you remember the great speech that Clark gives when he has his epic meltdown after he gets his 1 year Jelly of the Month Club membership.
The gift that keeps on giving the whole year, Clark.
That's right.
I love that line.
And he just, obviously he does a lot more than what I'm going to say, but his whole rant about if you're looking for last minute gift ideas, and I have one. I want my boss, Frank Shirley, here tonight. I want him brought from his happy holiday slumber on Melody Lane with all the other rich people. I want him brought here right now, the big ribbon on his head. He said a little more than that, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
And what the idea there was about knowing your audience, because what he didn't realize is he was talking to a really diverse group of people, including Cousin Eddie, who took everything literally. And so decided that he could help Clark and repay his hospitality for allowing him to, empty the shitter in his front yard and spend time at his house and buy presents for he and his wife by going and getting his boss from Melody Lane, getting him from a slumber and bringing him to the house, because that's what Clark said he wanted. And as a marketing person, that's something that we deal with all the time, is the idea that when we put a message out in the marketplace, we need to really know our audience and know it's really different. It's a really diverse audience. They're going to interpret things differently. They're going to look at something that we do visually and take a different meaning from it, sometimes good, sometimes bad. And it's important to make sure that you really do know your audience before you throw something out there, because the consequences can be dire in the workplace. I mean, if you're a marketing person and you put out the wrong message and it doesn't resonate well and it creates a negative perception of your company, or creates an environment where, the company has to go to, a crisis manager to try to solve something that's been put into the public, that's a real problem. Clark was lucky because he was able to talk his way out of it, as he did, in Vacation as well. There's a common theme between kidnapping bosses or managers. But so I think that's an important lesson that we get from both Clark and Cousin Eddie, is to make sure when you're talking to somebody, to know your audience.
I love that. And I would just like to add that my dad is like a version of Clark Griswold. Like, he's totally the guy that the neighbor would say, "Hey, where are you going to put a tree that big?" And he'd be like, "Bend over and I'll show you." Like, he's got that type of humor. So that's, I think, partially why I always love Clark Griswold, because I always saw my dad in him a little bit. I feel like if we keep going, we're just going to do like a full audio book and they won't even need to buy it on Amazon. so yeah.
There's a lot more in there, though. You get
Yeah, we're touching on little bits, and like I said, I love it. I think everybody should go pick up a copy. Let's talk about some of the movies that maybe weren't in the book, maybe movies that are going to be in the second or third version of the book. I would love to know, and this is one of my favorite comedies from the 80s, how you would possibly work this into the workplace. The 1981 comedy film Porky's.
It's funny that you say that, because I think we were talking earlier before the show.
Yeah.
That on social media, I typically put up 4 or 5 movies, and I ask people to vote on what they want the next chapter in the book to be, which is a lot of fun, and it creates a really cool interactive atmosphere for everybody, and people feel like they're part of the book, and they are part of the book, and it's fun for me too. Porky's comes up on a pretty consistent basis, and I got to tell you, one of the lessons that I'm writing the second book right now, and one of the chapters is Fast Times at Ridgemount High, and one of the lessons that we learned from that is it's okay to say I don't know. If you know the scene I'm talking about with Mr. Hand, where he asks Spicoli about being tardy and why are you always tardy, and he says I don't know. And my point is that in the workplace, it's actually okay to say I don't know. It shows confidence and strength. People used to think it showed weakness and vulnerability, but I think it shows confidence and strength to say I don't know. And so I'm going to tell you that's my answer for Porky's. I don't know. I don't know how I would actually work that into the workplace, and I'm not sure. If I did it, it would have to be in a separate book that might be more about life lessons from the 80s than workplace lessons. So
there you go. That could be a little spin-off for you.
Yeah, it could be. And so I don't know, but it is on the radar, and I have been thinking about it. Just like one of my favorites that I want to write about, and I'm trying to figure out how is 3 O'Clock High.
Okay, I'm not as familiar with that one.
Oh man, do yourself a favor. It's such an underrated 80s movie. It's a dark comedy.
Okay.
And it's phenomenal. And it probably has the best bully that you could ever imagine in a movie. I mean, the bully himself. The whole premise is basically and I won't obviously give all of this away right now, but the whole premise is essentially that there's a kid who works in a school store. He just lives his normal little existence as a school store. We used to have school stores in I don't know if they do anymore in school, but we had them where you got your supplies, your erasers and stuff. There's a kid who is transferred to their school, this big kid with a leather jacket who's transferred to their school. And there's all these rumors about how he stabbed a teacher at another school and that he got expelled there, and now they're accepting him here. And the kid who runs a school store happens to run into him in the bathroom. And they're in the urinals next to each other. And the kid from the school store, Jerry, decides, I'm going to say hello and introduce myself and try to be nice to him. And maybe let him know, like, there's people here who you could be friends with. And he introduces himself, and he puts his hand on the bully's shoulder. The bully just looks at him, looks at him, and says that basically no one touches him. And he says, you and me are going to fight at 3 o'clock today, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so the entire day, this kid is trying to get out of a fight. And it's a really fun kind of dark comedy. I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I will find that movie. Guarantee that.
I'm sorry. I'm just going to cut you both off, and I'm going to question your credibility here, Chris.
Why is that?
And I'm being joking and jovial, of course.
No,
and say, how can you say that he is better than Packard Walsh in The Wraith?
He is.
Better than Packard Walsh in The Wraith.
I'm telling you, when you watch this, you can tell me. Watch it and tell me, what do you think?
I've seen it many years ago, not in my adult life.
Okay.
But for my money, like bullies, Packard Walsh with his puka shell and his leather jacket, and Clint Howard as his sidekick, picking on and murdering Charlie Sheen, it doesn't get better than that.
Let it be known, JD is a diehard Clint Howard fan. So
much. Literally, my Xbox gamer tag audience is Packard Walsh.
So mine, if I used the bully, it would be Buddy Revell, who was 3 O'Clock High.
Which I looked him up real quick, JD. You'll love this. That's actually Crisp in Kindergarten Cop.
Yes. He was
a fantastic villain.
Yes, he's a great villain.
And Kindergarten Cop was actually a deadly serious movie, and they switched it to a comedy when they brought Schwarzenegger in.
Which is interesting because he did almost no comedy up to that point.
Yep.
And what is Dolph's excuse for the sequel?
I don't know. I have not watched the sequel. I don't plan to.
But you gotta put 3 O'Clock High on your list. Buddy Revell is a phenomenal bully.
Okay.
And it's well worth the watch. He was also in Black Hawk Down.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm writing that down as we speak, and I will be finding that movie and watching it. So now we're definitely going to talk a lot more about movies. We're actually going to make this kind of a two-parter. And we've been planning on doing this for a long time, but I thought who better to talk about the best John Hughes films of all time than a child of the 80s and an author of the 80s. So we're going to do that on the next episode. But Chris, go ahead and plug away on your book and the upcoming book and where people can follow you.
Yeah, sure. That's great. I really appreciate it, guys. This is a lot of fun. I'd actually like to do this for another hour, to be honest with you. Yeah, this has been great. So chrisclews.com, you plug that for me on the website. It's CHRISCLEWS.com. And that's where you can purchase my book on Amazon. It'll be in a wider distribution in the next, call it, few months. But right now it's on Amazon.com. And then I also speak at conferences and events as well on this topic. So of what the 80s movies teach us about the workplace. I'm doing an awful lot of corporate training, workshops, author conversations, speaking engagements. You can find me on Facebook at Chris Clews. You can find me LinkedIn, Chris Clews, and then of course Twitter. I got really lucky with Twitter when I started this whole process, and I finally self-published this book back in May. I went on Twitter to find a handle, and I just, for the hell of it, typed in at 80s pop culture, and it was available. I don't know how. I have no idea how that was available, but it was. So it's at 80s pop culture on Twitter, and those are basically the areas you can find me. And I'll tell you that I am, as I mentioned, I am working on the second book. My goal is to make this if I'm lucky, I'm going to make this a Chicken Soup for the Soul series, and we're going to have 12 to 15 books about 80s movies. I may once in a while throw a chapter in from a 90s movie that I think could have been made in the 80s. For example, Sandlot. I think Sandlot.
Love it.
If somebody didn't know that it was a 90s movie, it could be mistaken for an 80s movie. So the next book, I've got 5 chapters deep right now. That book has so far The Outsiders, Caddyshack, Fast Times at Ridgemount High, The Princess Bride, and my current chapter that I'm working on is The Lost Boys. There's a lot more of this content to come.
I feel like Batman should be on that list at some point.
It could be. It could be. I'll have to throw that onto my list of
Throw it on there.
chapters for.
Arguably the best Batman in my opinion. I love Michael Keaton.
He was a good Batman. And I'll tell you another one. That's probably going to be on the list as well. One of my favorite Christmas movies. And Die Hard is one of my favorite Christmas movies, but we can get into whether it's a Christmas movie. It is a Christmas movie, but Gremlins is also a Christmas movie.
Yes.
And that's one of my favorites of all time. I love Gremlins. I cannot get enough of Gremlins. So that will definitely be in one of my books coming soon.
Yeah, getting the reboot treatment as we speak. Animated film or TV show.
Can I throw something in about reboots real quick before we wrap up?
Absolutely.
Okay. They bother me a lot because so far I just wish they would re-release these movies as they were.
Yeah.
And I just, what I don't understand is if you're trying to make some money off of an existing property, re-releasing it is a heck of a lot cheaper than redoing it in a really bad way. And I'll tell you what really gets to me is I do not want to see another Patrick Swayze movie remade. Leave his movies exactly how they were. He was awesome. He's one of my favorites ever. And every time they redo one of his movies, Point Break, Red Dawn, I don't know what else they've done at this point. They're actually remaking Roadhouse, which I just think, why on earth are you can't remake Roadhouse. You need Patrick Swayze and Sam Elliott to work.
With Ronda Rousey of all people.
Yeah.
Is who that is supposedly with. That, God, please stop the production now and close that movie.
Just re-release it as it was. And
yeah.
And that was another great bad guy, by the way. That's a whole other conversation. We have villains of the 80s. But this reboot thing that's happening right now, the only way that I'm cool with a reboot is if they do it the way that YouTube Red did it with Karate Kid.
Yes.
That was awesome.
Not Karate Kid 2012 with Jaden Smith. God damn you people. But yes, the YouTube version is amazing. I love that entire show. I can't wait for season 2 to come out. And I actually just watched the trailer like 2 days ago. And it looks really good.
I'm all in on that Karate Kid reboot. I think it was smart the way they did it, the same way they're looking at doing The Sandlot, which I think, turning into a TV series. And it's, in 1989, I think is when they're going to be. Actually, of course, it's going to be in the 80s, which is great. This whole reboot thing, now they're talking about weird science.
Ugh,
I mean, just
no.
Stop.
What?
Stop it.
What do you think is the worst? Like what's been the absolute worst reboot?
I never saw it, but well, okay, that was more of a 90s one. The worst 80s reboot. God, that's a really good question. They've all been so bad that I can only honestly say that I've seen a few of them. And I'm not even really sure which one I could point to and say that was the worst 80s reboot. I will tell you the one that actually worked, but it was more of a TV show, was 21 Jump Street.
That was good. I did not like it. Wasn't that I hated the film, but I did not like the reboot of Vacation.
No.
And I love Ed Helms and I love Christina Applegate and like the writers I'm fans of too, like Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daly. And I was like, There's no way this is going to be bad. It was not good.
I wanted to love it.
I wanted to love that movie so bad. Yeah.
I wanted to love it, but I don't know. I looking back, I'm not sure which one was the worst reboot, but I'm sure that it's coming. What I can tell you is it's coming.
It's in pre-production as we speak.
it's in pre. Somebody's going to try to redo The Breakfast Club or Ferris Bueller, and it's just, yeah.
Hopefully his kids have put the kibosh on that until they go, and then their grandkids have control of it. I would imagine somebody like John Hughes probably owned his work. I could be wrong, but in the same way that Spielberg does, I hope that he does.
Yeah, that, and then of course, I mean, like I said, I'm a huge Patrick Swayze fan, so much that I wore a shirt on St. Patrick's Day that has him on it, and it says Happy St. Patrick Swayze Day, and it has him saying ditto. I'm a huge Patrick Swayze, and the other one that I really hope they never touch, I hope they never touch his movies, is John Candy.
I will break something if they start redoing John Candy movies like that. He's probably my top 5 favorite actors. We've already did like 3 of his movies on here.
And at 6'9", you breaking something would probably be.
Yeah, it's slightly under Andre the Giant. Just start busting things left and right. They did try to mess with Uncle Buck already and make it a TV show, and that flatlined after I think half a season. Nobody watched it. They touch anything else, we're gonna have issues.
Somebody tweeted out that day that John Candy's anniversary, and Ryan Reynolds did that great little in memoriam, which was just phenomenal. I want to give credit to the person who tweeted it, but I can't remember their handle at all. I'll just say that there was somebody fantastic in the Twitter universe who said what really sucked, what really came to light for him when he watched that was that there was never an opportunity for John Candy to play Chris Farley's dad.
Oh.
In a movie.
That would have been amazing.
Okay. And so, yeah, and I wish I could remember the person's name who tweeted that out, because I would love to give them credit for it, but man. I just kind of sat back when I saw that and I thought, yep, you know what? The world missed that.
Could you imagine him as Tommy Boy's dad?
Incredible.
I mean, not to take away from the actor that actually did play his dad in there, Brian Dennehy. He's fantastic, but I mean, yeah, I could just imagine John Candy being like, "Oh, Tommy boy, come in here, son. Meet your new mom." And Bo Derek comes out of the water. Is that for me, Dad? No, son, that's for me.
Yeah, that's got a classic line too. Did you eat paint chips when you were a kid?
No, why? No. Yeah, you said yeah. Oh gosh. All right. Well, we'll keep going for another hour if we don't pause it here. So again, thanks for coming on the show, guys. Make sure you support Chris. Follow him on Twitter at 80s Pop Culture, chrisclews.com, and then make sure you subscribe to the podcast, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Castbox, YouTube. We are at Back in Time Pod on Twitter, Instagram. We're on Facebook. You can email us at backintimepodcast@gmail.com. But it is time to climb back into the DeLorean, punch in today's date, and return back to present day. Thanks for listening. Talk to you later in the week. See ya.